The silence in the communal hall was a living thing, heavy and sharp as a shard of obsidian. It descended in the wake of a single sound. A child's clear, piping voice shaping a word that had no place in his mouth. My son, Ren, had not yet seen his second winter. His world was small, the warmth of my arms, the taste of milk, the rough texture of the furs in our small cottage at the pack's edge. He had babbled, he had cooed, he had cried, but he had never spoken, not until now. The air still tasted of wood smoke and roasted meat from the evening meal, a scent of comfort now turned to ash in my throat. Every eye was on us. The pack, a breathing wall of suspicion, had frozen in place. Mothers clutched their own children closer, their gazes a mixture of pity and a terrible, cutting fear. A curse, I saw them thinking. An omen. My world had just shattered, and the sound it made was my little boy's first word. "Kaylin." He said it again, this time quieter, a soft sigh. He was pointing, his small, clumsy finger, aimed not at me, his mother, but over my shoulder, towards the shadowed entrance of the hall. It was as if he were simply naming a familiar shape, like moon or fire, but this was a name. A grown man's name, a warrior's. Panic, cold and sharp, coiled in my belly. I pulled Ren tighter against my chest, his milky scent a stark contrast to the rising tang of pack anxiety. I tried to cover his mouth with my hand, a useless gesture, an attempt to put the sound back in, to rewind time by a mere 10 seconds. But the damage was done. The word was out, hanging in the thick air between the hearth fire and the rafters, a thing of terrible, impossible power. "What was that?" Elder Maeve's voice was brittle, like dry leaves skittering across frozen ground. She was all sharp angles and disapproval, her silver hair braided so tightly it pulled at her temples. She rose slowly from the elder's table, her knuckles white where they gripped the wood. "Elara, what did the child say?" I couldn't speak. My throat was a knot of raw fear. As a widowed Omega, my existence was already one of quiet subservience. I kept my head down, did my mending and cleaning, and raised my son in the shadow of the man I had lost. I was tolerated, a ghost at the edge of the pack's vibrant life. But this drew the eye of every wolf. This was a violation of something sacred. The bond was the pack's soul. It was a gift from the moon, bestowed upon us at the cusp of adulthood, a sacred thread connecting two wolves, a promise of strength and continuity. A child could not know it. A child could not choose. It was a law as old as the mountains that encircled our territory. "He is just a baby, Fel," I whispered, my voice hoarse. I hugged Ren so fiercely he squirmed, his little legs kicking against me. "He doesn't know what he's saying. It's just a sound." A lie. It was a perfect crystalline sound. A name. A sound? Another elder, Boren, scoffed. His face was a roadmap of scars from 100 territorial disputes. "That was no mere sound, woman. He spoke the warrior's name, Dravos." The surname landed like a stone in a still pond, the ripples of its significance spreading through the assembled pack. Kaylin Dravos. He was not an alpha, not a beta, but something else entirely. A warrior who walked the lonely paths of our borders, a man spoken of in hushed tones. They called him the Scarred Hand, the Winter Wolf. He was the pack's silent, brutal guardian, a figure of myth as much as flesh and blood. He rarely came into the village, and when he did, a silence followed him like his own shadow. And my son, my tiny, innocent son, had just claimed him. The heavy oak door of the hall groaned open, letting in a swirl of frigid night air that smelled of pine and coming snow, and with it, him, as if the word itself had been a summons. Kaylin Dravos stood on the threshold, a giant silhouetted against the deep indigo of the twilight sky. He was built like the ancient oaks in the heart of the forest, broad and unyielding. Snow dusted the dark fur cloak on his shoulders. The firelight caught the silver threads in his black hair and glinted off the hilt of the knife at his belt. His face was all harsh lines and shadow, dominated by a long pale scar that cut from his left temple down across his cheek, disappearing into the line of his jaw. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from my lungs. They were the color of a winter storm, a piercing, pale gray, and they were fixed on me, on the child in my arms. The whispers in the hall died instantly. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to have been hushed by his presence. He took a step inside, his worn leather boots making no sound on the stone floor. He moved with the predator's grace that belied his size. His gaze didn't waver. I saw no anger in it, no accusation. I saw something far more terrifying: confusion. And beneath it, a flicker of something deep and resonant. A stunned recognition that mirrored the impossible thing my son had just done. It was as the premise whispered in my soul. A look torn between fear and something deeper. He felt it too. This broken, impossible bond. Alpha Gregor rose from his seat at the head table. He was a fair alpha, strong and steady, but his rule was built on tradition. The laws of the moon were his foundation. "Kaelin," he said, his voice a low rumble of authority. "Your name was just spoken." Kaelin's gaze finally broke from mine, shifting to the alpha. He gave a short, respectful nod. I heard. His voice was deeper than I remembered, rough like granite. "By this child," Gregor continued, gesturing towards us. The storm in Kaelin's eyes intensified as he looked back at me. I felt stripped bare, a specimen under his scrutiny. He smelled of the wild, of cold stone and pine needles, and the clean, sharp scent of snow. It was a lonely smell, a dangerous one. My own wolf, a timid, grieving creature that had been little more than a whisper inside me since my mate's death, stirred for the first time in years. It wasn't a call of challenge or of submission, but a painful, bewildered ache. "Counsel," Gregor commanded. "Ilara, bring the boy." The word was a death sentence. My legs refused to move. To walk forward was to admit this was real. To present my son to them was to place him on an altar for judgment. "Now, Ilara." My feet scraped against the stone as I forced myself to obey. Each step was an agony. The pack parted before me, their faces a blur of morbid curiosity. I could feel their thoughts like a physical weight, the Omega's cursed child, the widow's shame. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, on the worn soles of my own shoes, on anything but the sea of watching faces, or the towering figure of the warrior who now stood beside the Alpha's table. When I reached the dais, I couldn't bring myself to look up. I simply stood there, trembling, clutching Ren to my chest, as if he were a shield. "Let me see him," Elder Maeve commanded, her voice sharp. With shaking hands, I turned Ren slightly so they could see his face. He wasn't crying, he was calm, his wide, dark eyes staring right at Kaelin Dravos. And then he did it again. "Kaelin," he said, his little hand reaching out from the folds of my tunic, straining towards the warrior. A collective gasp went through the hall. This was no accident. This was no misspoken sound. This was a call. I finally dared to look at Kaelin. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle jumped along the scar. His hands were fisted at his sides. He was staring at my son with an expression of such raw, visceral shock that it made my heart ache for him. He looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning from a clear sky. The bond, meant to be a blessing, a joyous discovery between two destined souls, was twisting his face into a mask of torment. "This is an abomination," Boren snarled, his voice thick with disgust. "A perversion of the moon's will. The child is an omen. A darkness has fallen on this pack." "He is a baby," I cried, my own voice cracking. The shame I'd felt moments before was burned away by a fierce, protective fire. "He is innocent." "Innocence is irrelevant in the face of such a bad sign," Maeve countered coldly. "Fate has been broken. A bond cannot form with a child. And it certainly cannot be a one-sided claim. Kaelin Dravos, do you feel it? Do you feel any connection to this pup?" All eyes swung to the warrior. The silence stretched, thin and taut. I held my breath, praying he would say no. "Please deny it. Set us free. Let us go back to our cottage and our quiet life. Let this be a nightmare." Kaelin's gaze lifted from Ren and met mine. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. There was no hall, no council, no pack. There was only the storm in his eyes and the desperate plea in mine. I saw the truth there, the answer he was fighting, the war raging behind his stony expression. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, his throat working. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head, not in denial, but in disbelief. Finally he spoke, his voice a low rasp that carried to every corner of the silent hall. "I don't know." The three words echoed in the sudden, profound vacuum of the hall. It was not a denial. A denial would have been a blade, sharp and clean, severing the impossible tie my son had forged. It would have meant scorn, exile perhaps, but it would have been an end. This uncertainty from a man as resolute and fearsome as Kalin Dravos was a chain. It bound us to him, to this mystery, to the judgment of the pack. His confusion was a confession. It gave the omen teeth. Alpha Gregor's expression hardened. He looked from Kalin's tormented face to my own, and then down at the small child nestled in my arms, who was now sleepily rubbing his eyes, oblivious to the storm he had unleashed. "Uncertainty is not an answer the pack can accept, Kalin," the Alpha said, his voice low and dangerous. "The bond is absolute. It is there, or it is not." "He is a child," Kalin ground out, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. "It is not possible." "And yet he spoke your name," Elder Maeve countered, her voice thin and sharp. "He reached for you. We all saw it. Something unnatural has happened here, Alara Vathrin." Her gaze fell upon me, heavy with accusation. "Something you brought into this pack." My blood ran cold. I brought this, as if my grief, my quiet widowhood, had somehow soured and given birth to this curse. I clutched Ren tighter, my knuckles white. "I have done nothing," I whispered, my voice trembling. He is all I have." Alpha Gregor held up a hand, silencing the murmurs that began to ripple through the crowd. "Enough. No judgment will be passed this night." He sounded weary, the burden of this unprecedented event settling on his broad shoulders. "Elara, take the boy home. You will remain in your cottage. You will speak to no one of this. Kalin," he fixed the warrior with a hard stare, "you will report to me at dawn. We will seek the moon's wisdom." Dismissed, not exonerated. We were a disease being quarantined. I nodded numbly, turning without another word. The walk from the dais to the great hall door felt 100 miles long. The pack parted for me as they had before, but now there was no morbid curiosity in their eyes. There was fear. And where there is fear, hatred soon follows. I could feel their gazes on my back, a physical weight of suspicion. They were whispers I couldn't quite hear. The rustle of a pack turning against one of its own. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I didn't want to see Kalin's stormy eyes following me, his presence a brand on my skin. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the biting cold of the night, pulling my thin cloak around myself and my son. The door boomed shut behind us, cutting off the warmth and light, leaving us in the dark. Our cottage was the last one on the path that led into the deep woods, a place befitting an Omega widow and her child, present but not truly a part of the village heart. The journey was short, but tonight it felt like a perilous trek through enemy territory. Moonlight cast long, skeletal shadows from the pines, and every rustle of wind sounded like a pursuing footstep. Ren had fallen asleep, his small head a heavy, precious weight against my shoulder, his soft breaths warming my neck. He was the only warmth in a world that had suddenly become frozen. Inside the small, one-room cottage, the embers in the hearth glowed faintly. I added a few small logs, coaxing them back to life. The familiar scent of wood smoke, a small comfort. I laid Ren in his cradle, a hollowed-out log lined with soft rabbit pelts that had been my mate's last gift to him. He sighed in his sleep, one tiny fist curled near his cheek. Looking at his innocent face, a wave of desperate, helpless love washed over me. He had not done this out of malice. He knew no better. He had simply spoken a truth his soul recognized, a truth our world had no place for. What had I done to deserve this? I had loved my mate, Aaron. Our bond had been simple, warm, and true. He was a hunter, kind and quiet, and his death on a boar hunt the previous winter had hollowed out my world. My wolf, once content, had retreated into a silent place of grief, and I had been left a shell, focusing every ounce of my being on the child he had left me. I followed the rules. I kept to myself. I did not ask for more than the pack's tolerance. And in return, fate had handed me this impossible, dangerous gift. Kalin Dravos. The name was a myth, a fireside story to frighten pups. They said he had wrestled a shadow cat with his bare hands and won. They said he could track a whisper on the wind. They said the scar on his face was a gift from a vengeful forest spirit he had defied. He was the wolf who walked alone, the sentinel at the borders, the necessary darkness that kept the pack safe. And now, my son had tied our fragile lives to his. A floorboard creaked outside my door. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, every muscle tensing. It couldn't be. No one ever came to my cottage, especially not at this hour. My gaze darted to the window, a small square of hide scraped thin to let in the light. Through it, I saw only the shifting, inky blackness of the pines. I held my breath, listening. The wind sighed through the eaves, the fire crackled. And then a sound I could not mistake, the soft crunch of a heavy footstep on the thin layer of snow just outside. Panic seized me. Was it one of the elders, or worse, a pack member, emboldened by the alpha's indecision, come to deliver their own brand of justice? My hand went to the small iron poker resting by the hearth, my only weapon. It felt flimsy and useless in my grasp. Another creak, closer this time. A shadow blotted out the moonlight from the window. A massive form standing just beyond my door. My wolf, dormant for so long, awoke with a snarl of pure terror. "Protect the pup! Protect the pup!" A low, quiet knock sounded on the wooden door. 3 soft raps. It wasn't the sound of anger or aggression, it was hesitant. My mind raced. Who would come here now? Elara Vathrin. The voice was a low rumble, the sound of stones grinding together. It vibrated through the very wood of the door. Kalen. My blood turned to ice water. Why was he here? Had the council sent him? Was he here to finish what was started? To silence the source of the omen? I backed away from the door, pulling the poker tight against my chest. "Go away," I whispered, my voice choked with fear. "I am not here to harm you," the voice came again, closer, as if he were leaning against the door. I could smell him. Even through the wood, that wild scent of pine and cold air. It was overwhelming, primal. "Open the door." It was not a command. It was a request, but from a man like him. The distinction was meaningless. Refusal felt more dangerous than compliance. My hand trembled as I reached for the simple wooden latch. My life, my son's life, felt as fragile as that single piece of wood. Slowly, I lifted it. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, and he was there, filling the entire frame, seeming to suck all the air from my small cottage. He was even larger up close. The firelight flickered across his harsh features, making the scar on his face seem to writhe like a pale snake. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on me, intense and unreadable. He held a small bundle of split, dry logs in the crook of one arm. An offering, a reason. "Your woodpile is low," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. "The nights are getting colder." I stared at him, dumbfounded. The most feared warrior in the pack was standing on my doorstep, offering me firewood. The sheer absurdity of it broke through my terror for a moment. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice stronger than I expected. He took a half step inside, and I instinctively took one back. He stopped, noticing my fear. He dropped the firewood gently onto the floor just inside the door. "To understand," he said, his gaze dropping to the cradle where Ren slept. A fresh wave of protective fury surged through me. "He is sleeping. You will not disturb him." "I have no intention of it." He looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw the raw conflict warring in his eyes. It was the same stunned disbelief from the hall, but now it was closer, more potent. "Has he ever done anything like this before? Spoken a name?" I shook my head, clutching the poker tighter. "He has never spoken a word until tonight." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "It makes no sense. The bond chooses equals, warriors and healers, alphas and their lunas. It does not choose this." He didn't say it with cruelty, but with the cold logic of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "It does not choose a child and a broken omega." "Then tell the council that," I pleaded. "Tell them you feel nothing. Release us from this." His jaw tightened. A lie would not hold. They would know. He took another slow step into the room, his eyes scanning the sparse, clean space. His gaze lingered on a small, crudely carved wooden wolf on the mantelpiece, Aaron's last carving. "I do not feel the pull of a mate," he said, his voice dropping lower. "But when the boy spoke my name, something—" He trailed off, shaking his head again as if to clear it. Something answered. He was closer now, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. A stark contrast to the cold night clinging to his cloak. The scent of him was dizzying. My dormant wolf was stirring, not with fear anymore, but with a deep, unsettling curiosity. It recognized something in his scent, something ancient, something that belonged. "Stay away from us," I warned, my voice a breathy whisper. He ignored me, his gaze fixed on my face. "You have soot on your cheek." Before I could react, he lifted his hand. It was a large, calloused hand, the hand of a warrior, crisscrossed with faint white scars. He moved with impossible gentleness, his thumb coming up to brush against my cheekbone. The moment his skin touched mine, a jolt, white-hot and electric, shot through me. It was like lightning striking a dead tree, arcing down my spine and setting every nerve ablaze. My breath hitched. The iron poker slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the stone floor. His eyes widened in shock. I saw the jolt reflected there, saw his own body go rigid. He snatched his hand back as if my skin had burned him, his expression one of horror. He felt it. He felt it too. That single fleeting touch had shattered his denial. It was real. This impossible, terrifying connection was real. And it hummed in the air between us, a living, breathing thing. He stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and a dawning dread. Then without another word, he turned and was gone, vanishing back into the suffocating darkness of the pines, leaving me trembling in the sudden, echoing silence of my home, the phantom heat of his touch still burning on my skin. Sleep did not come. How could it when the ghost of a touch still burned on my skin? I sat on the cold stone floor before the dying embers, long after the scent of pine and winter had faded from my cottage. I hugged my knees to my chest, replaying the moment over and over, the shock in Kalen's eyes, the way he had recoiled as if from a serpent's bite. It was not the touch of a destined mate finding his other half. It was the touch of a man discovering a curse had taken root in his own flesh. He felt it. He had denied it to the council, or tried to, but his body had betrayed him. That brief, searing connection had been a truth more powerful than any words. It was a chaotic, unwelcome thing, a wild magic that answered to no laws I had ever known, and it terrified him. That, more than anything, lodged a shard of ice in my heart. A bond was meant to be a source of strength, of completion. For Kalen Dravos, it was clearly a threat. My wolf, the quiet, grieving creature within me, was no longer silent. She was pacing the confines of my soul, agitated and confused. For 2 years, she had been a hollow echo, mourning the mate she had lost. Now she was awake. She was not drawn to Kalen with the gentle pull of companionship she'd felt for Aaron. This was different. It was a primal, unsettling awareness, a recognition that went deeper than thought or emotion. It was the instinct that recognizes the storm on the horizon. The wolf that sensed the apex predator upwind. She knew him, and she was afraid of what that knowing meant. When the first pale gray fingers of dawn crept through the hide window, I was still awake. Ren stirred in his cradle, making small, snuffly sounds as he began to wake. The sight of him, so small and utterly unaware, solidified my resolve. Fear was a luxury I could not afford. For him, I had to be stone. I had to be steel. I rose on stiff limbs, my body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. I added the wood Kalen had left to the fire, the simple domestic act feeling strangely significant. It was his presence, lingering in my home. An omen on the doorstep. I forced myself to eat a piece of dry bread and some cheese, knowing I would need my strength. Today, the pack would be waiting. Their judgment had only been deferred, not dismissed. Dressing Ren, I wrapped him in the warmest furs I owned, tucking him securely into a sling I wore across my chest. His warmth against my heart was a small anchor in a churning sea. I braided my own dark hair tightly, pulling it back from my face. I would not let them see me as a frightened, disheveled creature. I would meet their eyes. I was Alara Vathrin, Aaron's widow, Ren's mother. I had a right to exist, a right to breathe the same air as them. But the moment I stepped outside, the force of their collective will hit me like a physical blow. The village was quiet, but it was a loud, watchful silence. As I walked toward the communal well, buckets in hand, I saw figures disappear into doorways. A mother who I had shared a meal with only 2 nights ago saw me coming, snatched her playing child by the arm, and pulled him inside, slamming the door. Their fear was a tangible thing, polluting the crisp morning air. They were shunning me, building a wall of silence and suspicion around me and my son. My cottage was at the edge of the village, so I had to walk the full length of the path to reach the well at its center. Every step was an ordeal. I kept my head high, my gaze fixed forward, but I could feel their eyes on me from behind their windows. The whispers followed me, just on the edge of hearing, like the skittering of rats in the walls. Cursed, unnatural, bad blood. I reached the well. It was deserted. Usually at this hour, it was a hub of activity, women gossiping as they drew water for the morning. Today, they had clearly seen me coming and scattered. They would rather their families went thirsty for an hour than share the space with me. The loneliness was a bitter pill, but the insult was worse. They were treating me as if I were diseased. Gritting my teeth, I began to lower a bucket into the dark, stone-lined shaft. The rope was coarse and cold against my hands. Ren was quiet in his sling, his wide, curious eyes taking in the world. He was the reason I was here. The reason I had to endure this. The Omega dares show her face. The voice was a low snarl. I froze, my hand tight on the rope. I didn't have to turn to know who it was. Elder Boren. Slowly I straightened up and faced him. He was standing a few feet away, his arms crossed over his massive chest. His scarred face was a mask of contempt. He was not alone. 2 other males from his lineage, broad-shouldered and dull-eyed, stood behind him, a threat, a show of force. "I am fetching water for my son," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "Your omen," Boren corrected, spitting the word. "You should have stayed in your hovel, witch. Your presence taints the heart of this pack." "I have done nothing wrong," I insisted, my heart starting to pound against my ribs. Ren, sensing my fear, began to squirm against my chest, his lip trembling. "Nothing wrong?" Boren took a step closer, his scent thick with aggression. "You birthed a perversion, a child that speaks in curses and tries to bind our strongest warrior with dark magic. Do you think we are fools? We know what you are. A crack in the foundation of this pack, and cracks must be filled." He was so close now I could see the broken veins in his eyes. The 2 males behind him shifted, fanning out slightly, cutting off any chance of escape. My wolf was snarling, a desperate, cornered sound in my head. Threat to the pup. Threat. "The Alpha told me to remain in my cottage," I said, trying to appeal to the only authority he might respect. "He did not say I should let my son die of thirst." "The Alpha is soft," Boren sneered. "He speaks of seeking wisdom when he should be purging the unclean. But some of us still remember the old ways. We know how to deal with bad signs." He reached out a thick, grimy hand and grabbed my arm. His touch was brutish, a violation. I cried out and tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. Ren, terrified by the sudden violence, burst into tears, his small, wailing cries piercing the morning air. "Let go of me," I shouted, struggling against him. "You will come with us," Boren growled, starting to drag me away from the well. "We will take you to the cleansing stones. The mountain will decide if you and your spawn are fit to live among us." Panic, raw and absolute, tore through me. The cleansing stones were a brutal relic of a crueler time, a place where the accused were left to the elements. It was a death sentence. No one was coming to help. Through my fear-blurred eyes, I could see faces in the windows, watching. They were silent, complicit. My son's cries were the only sound in a village that had condemned us, and then the world went silent. The whispers stopped. Boren's forward momentum ceased. Even Ren's crying hitched as a new presence fell over the square. A shadow had fallen over us, cold and vast. I looked up. Kalen Dravos was standing at the edge of the square, not 10 feet away. He must have come from the forest path, for he had made no sound. He wasn't breathing heavily, he wasn't angry. He was perfectly still, a figure carved from winter stone. His pale gray eyes were not on me. They were fixed on Boren's hand, the one clamped around my arm. The air crackled. The predator had entered the hunting ground. Boren, for all his bluster, was not a fool. He knew Kalen's reputation. He slowly released my arm, shoving me back a step. "Dravos heit kavals," he grunted, trying to sound dismissive. "This is council business, an internal matter." "Your hand was on her," Kalen said. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, which made it infinitely more terrifying. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. "She is a threat," Boren insisted, though his bravado was visibly cracking. His two cronies looked uneasy, shifting their weight from foot to foot. "Her child has brought a curse upon us." Kalen took a single deliberate step forward. "Her child spoke my name." He stated it as a simple, undeniable fact. "That makes it my business." The possessiveness in his tone was unmistakable. He wasn't just intervening. He was claiming jurisdiction. He was drawing a line in the snow around me and my son. He looked at me then, his gaze sweeping over me, checking for injury, before settling on my crying son. A flicker of something, pain, confusion, regret, crossed his face. He looked back at Boren, and his eyes were chips of ice. "Go," Kalen said. The word was not a suggestion. It was a command backed by the certainty of violence. Boren bristled, his pride warring with his instinct for self-preservation. "You cannot defend this warrior. The bond is sacred. What they have done is blasphemy." Kalen didn't even blink. He simply tilted his head, a gesture of profound menace. "I will not say it again." For a long, tense moment, the two males faced off. But there was no contest. Boren was a pack bully. Kalen was a killer. Boren knew it. With a final, venomous glare at me, he turned and stalked away, his two followers trailing behind him like chastened dogs. The square remained empty. The watching eyes were still there, but no one dared to emerge. I stood there, trembling, trying to soothe Ren, who was still hiccuping with sobs. Kalen walked towards me, his boots crunching softly on the snow. He stopped a few feet away, keeping a careful distance, as if remembering the effect of his touch last night. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice now a low rumble. I shook my head, unable to speak. I was overwhelmed with a dizzying mix of terror and a fierce, shocking gratitude. He had defended us. He had stood for us when the entire pack had turned their backs. "They will not stop," I finally managed to whisper, stroking Ren's hair. "They see us as a blight." "Let them," he said, his gaze hard as it swept over the silent houses around us. "They will not touch you again." It was a vow, a promise spoken into the cold air, sealing us under his protection whether he wanted to or not. As if summoned by the gravity of the moment, another figure appeared. It was the Alpha's beta, a stern, gray-muzzled wolf named Fendrel. He walked directly to us, his face grim, ignoring the charged atmosphere completely. His eyes met Kalen's, then mine. "Alpha Gregor summons you," Fendrel announced, his voice booming in the quiet square. He looked from my talk. I faced to the warriors, his expression giving nothing away. "Both of you, the council is convened. Your trial is to begin." The walk to the council chamber was a silent, suffocating procession. Fendrel, the beta, led the way, his back a rigid wall of duty. I followed, clutching Ren so tightly he squirmed in his sling. Kalen walked beside me. He did not touch me, did not speak to me, but his presence was a tangible shield. The air around him seemed to warp, pushing back the hostile stares and venomous whispers of the pack members who watched from their doorways. They feared him more than they hated me, and for that, a strange tangled knot of gratitude and terror tightened in my chest. He was my protector and my curse, my shield and the source of the sword hanging over my head. His scent, pine, stone, and that wild, lonely coldness was a constant grounding reality in a world that had dissolved into a nightmare. We were not led to the Great Hall this time. Fendrel took us to a smaller, more ancient building set behind it, half buried in the hillside. The Elder's Chamber. I had only ever seen it from a distance. It was built of dark, heavy logs, silvered with age, and its roof was thick with moss. The air grew colder as we approached, and the scent of old wood, damp earth, and something else, something like old power and older secrets, clung to the stones. Inside the chamber was a single circular room, dominated by a cold central hearth of black stone. The walls were unadorned, the heavy beams above lost in shadow. The Council of Elders was already seated on a curved stone bench that followed the wall, their faces grim and unyielding in the thin light that filtered through a single smoke hole in the roof. Alpha Gregor stood before the hearth, his expression unreadable. This was not a gathering, it was an inquisition. Fendrel motioned for us to stand in the center of the room. We were surrounded. There was no escape. Kalen placed himself slightly in front of me, a subtle protective shift of his body that did not go unnoticed by the elders. "The pack is unsettled," Alpha Gregor began, his voice echoing in the oppressive silence. "An event has occurred that defies our laws and our history. A bond has been claimed by a child, directed at a warrior. Elder Maeve, state the charge." Maeve rose, her spine as straight and unforgiving as a spear. "The charge is corruption of the sacred bond," she declared, her voice ringing with zealous authority. "Elara Vathrin, whether by ignorance or by malicious design, has brought forth a child who has perverted the moon's most holy gift. This perversion threatens the sanctity of every bond in this pack, and the stability of our future. It is an omen of the darkest kind, a rot that has begun in our heart." Her words struck me like physical blows. My knees felt weak. I held Ren closer, his little face buried in my shoulder. He was quiet now, his earlier terror having exhausted him into a wary silence. "And you, Kalen Dravos," she continued, turning her sharp gaze on him. "You stand accused of complicity. You have not denied this connection. You have defended the source of the curse. You place this broken Omega and her unnatural spawn above the welfare of the pack." Kalen did not flinch. His stormy eyes were fixed on the Alpha. "I defended a mother and her child from being dragged from the village by a bully," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "My duty is to protect all members of this pack, especially the weak, from threats both external and internal." His gaze flickered towards Boren, whose face darkened with rage. "Your duty is to the pack's health," Boren roared, surging to his feet. "And that thing she carries is a disease." "Enough, Boren," Gregor commanded, his voice sharp with authority. Boren sat down, fuming. The Alpha's gaze fell on Kalen. "But the question remains. Last night, you said you did not know if you felt the bond. Have you had time to reflect? Has the moon offered you clarity? What do you feel, Kalen? The pack requires a definitive answer." This was the moment, the pivot upon which our lives would turn. I held my breath, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I prayed he would lie, that he would find the words to sever this connection and set us free, even if it meant my exile. Kalen was silent for a long moment, the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried a raw, grudging honesty that was more damning than any lie. "I do not feel the pull of a mate," he said, his words precise, carefully chosen. "There is no call for completion, no song in my blood that answers to her." He glanced at me, his expression unreadable stone. "But there is a resonance, an echo. When the child speaks my name, when he is near, there is a thread, taut, unnatural. It is not a bond, it is a chain." A horrified gasp went through the elders. A chain. He had given it a name, and the name was a thing of horror. He felt tied to us against his will, cursed. It was all the proof they needed. "Sorcery," Maeve whispered, her eyes alight with grim victory. "A binding spell, woven with the blood of a child. She has snared him." "That is absurd," I found my voice, a desperate, shaking thing. "I know nothing of such magic. I am a mender, a mother, not a witch." "Then how do you explain it?" Boren challenged. "How does a babe who cannot even speak his own mother's name call out to a man he has never met?" I had no answer. There was no rational explanation. I could only shake my head, tears of frustration and terror blurring my vision. "I don't know." "The pack cannot live with I don't know," Alpha Gregor said, his face grave. "This uncertainty is a poison. It must be lanced. There is one way to know the truth of a bond, or the nature of a curse. An older way, a trial of blood." My blood ran cold. I knew the legends. A brutal, ancient rite, not used in generations, where the truth was supposedly revealed in the mixing of blood. "No," I whispered. Maeve smiled, a thin, cruel curving of her lips. "It is the only way. The blood does not lie. We will draw blood from the child and the warrior. We will see how they greet each other upon the heartstone of this chamber. If it is a true, albeit twisted bond, it will recognize its kin. If it is a curse, it will curdle and blacken, and the source must be purged. Purged. A death sentence. and they would use my son to deliver it. No! My voice was a shriek. The terrified Omega was gone, replaced by a mother backed into a corner. I shielded Ren with my body, turning away from them. You will not touch him. You will not spill a drop of my son's blood. I forbid it. You are in no position to forbid anything, woman, Bourne snarled, taking a step forward. Give us the child. Stay back, I screamed, a feral sound torn from my throat. My own dormant wolf was awake and raging, a desperate, hopeless fury. Bourne lunged. He never reached me. In a movement so fast it was a blur, Kalen was between us. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply caught Bourne's arm in one massive hand, his fingers digging into the male's thick bicep. Bourne cried out, his knees buckling from the pressure. You will not, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Touch either of them. He released Bourne, shoving him back. Bourne stumbled, clutching his arm, his face a mask of pain, fury, and shock. Kalen turned to face the Alpha and the Elders, his body a solid wall between them and me. The child is not part of this, he declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. He is an infant, an innocent. The connection, this chain, it is between her and me. He flicked his gaze back to me, and for a fleeting instant, I saw a raw, agonizing conflict in his eyes. He was tying himself to my fate, and he hated it, but he was doing it anyway. To protect my son. If you want blood, Kalen continued, turning back to the council, then you will take ours. Mine and hers. Test us. Leave the boy out of it. The chamber was plunged into a stunned silence. This was an escalation no one had expected. The reclusive, solitary warrior was publicly, irrevocably linking his fate to that of the disgraced Omega. He was offering himself up for judgment alongside me. Alpha Gregor stared at Kalen, his eyes narrowed in thought. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. So be it, Maeve. Prepare the Heartstone. A cold dread washed over me, but it was mingled with a dizzying sense of awe. He had just saved Ren. He had placed himself upon the altar in my son's place. Maeve approached the black stone hearth. From a leather pouch at her belt, she produced a small, wickedly sharp knife made of gleaming obsidian. The Heartstone in the center of the hearth was a smooth, gray river rock, worn flat by ages of use. It was said to be a tear from the moon itself. Your hands, she commanded. My own hand was trembling so violently I could barely hold it out. Kalen offered his left palm without hesitation. It was a broad, calloused hand, mapped with the faint white lines of old scars. Maeve took it first. With a swift, practiced motion, she drew the obsidian blade across his palm. A line of dark red blood welled up instantly. She did not flinch, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes as she looked at his blood. Respect? Fear? Then she turned to me. Her grip was like talons as she took my hand. I squeezed my eyes shut as the blade bit into my own flesh, a sharp, stinging pain. Hold your hands over the stone, she instructed. Let the blood fall together. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. Side by side, our hands trembling over the ancient stone, we stood. Kalen's gaze was fixed on the stone, his jaw tight. I couldn't bear to look. I stared at the side of his face, the harsh line of his jaw, the pale, terrifying scar. A single drop of his blood fell, landing on the gray stone with a dark splash. Then a drop of mine fell beside it. The moment my blood touched the stone, a collective gasp went through the chamber. I forced myself to look down. It was not curdling. It was not blackening. It was burning. Where our blood had touched the stone, a faint silvery light began to glow, pulsing with a soft internal luminescence. It wasn't the gentle glow of a recognized bond. It was fierce, hungry. As we watched, frozen in horror, Kalen's drop of blood began to move. It flowed across the stone, not like a liquid, but like a living thing, a tiny crimson predator. It touched my drop of blood, and instead of mixing, it consumed it. My blood was drawn into his, vanishing completely, leaving only his, which now glowed with twice the intensity. By the first wolf, an elder whispered in terrified awe. But it wasn't over. The light from the blood didn't fade. It sank into the Heartstone itself, and from beneath the surface, ancient lines, carved there millennia ago and worn smooth with time, began to glow with that same hungry silver light. An intricate, forgotten symbol blazed to life on the stone's face. A spiraling knot of thorns, encircling two wolves, one devouring the other. Maeve stared at the glowing symbol, her face as pale as bone ash. All her zealous certainty had vanished, replaced by a deep, primal terror. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horrifying recognition. "What is it?" Alpha Gregor demanded, his voice strained. "Maeve, what is that mark?" She backed away from the stone, shaking her head, her gaze darting between me and Kaelin, as if we had suddenly grown fangs and claws. "It is not a curse," she whispered, her voice a reedy, trembling thing. "It is the unspoken prophecy." The silence that followed Maeve's words was deeper and more terrifying than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the weight of forgotten histories and the dread of a future no one had prepared for. The glowing symbol on the heartstone pulsed with a cold, silver light, casting the faces of the elders in stark, flickering relief. The two wolves, one devouring the other, seemed to mock us from the stone, a brutal perversion of the sacred union a bond was meant to be. "The unspoken prophecy?" Alpha Gregor's voice was a low growl of disbelief. "Maeve, that is a myth. A scare story for pups who will not sleep. A story whose truth we now see burning before us," Maeve countered, her voice shaking but regaining a sliver of its old authority. She could not tear her gaze from the glowing stone, from the blood that had revealed the forgotten mark. It was a prophecy of the first alphas, passed down in whispers only from elder to elder, because its meaning was too terrible to be common knowledge. It was never written, never spoken aloud in the Great Hall. It was a warning. All eyes were on her now, a circle of grim, shadowed faces demanding answers. Kaelin had lowered his hand, but his gaze was still locked on the symbol, a muscle jumping in his jaw. The chain he had spoken of now had a name, a history. It was a prophecy. "Speak it," Gregor commanded. "Speak the prophecy now." Maeve took a deep, shuddering breath. Her eyes met mine across the pulsating light, and I saw in them not just fear, but a dawning, terrible pity. "When the bond is born wrong, a child's tongue its first bell," she began, her voice a reedy chant, reciting words from a deep and ancient memory. "The winter wolf shall be chained to the silent shell." My blood turned to ice. The silent shell. The name pierced me. It was me. The quiet, grieving Omega, a shell of the wolf I had once been, and Kaelin, the winter wolf, the solitary guardian, the cold warrior, the prophecy had named us. Maeve continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she spoke the final, damning lines. "One shall consume the other's soul to mend the broken fate, and from their ruin, a new power the moon shall create. One must be sacrificed for the pack to survive. One must be devoured for the other to thrive. Devoured, consumed." The word hung in the air, a vile, choking poison. The symbol on the stone now made a horrifying kind of sense. It was not a union, it was an annihilation. Our impossible connection was not a bond of creation, but one of destruction. One of us was destined to spiritually, perhaps even physically, destroy the other to fulfill some terrible cosmic balance. The elders stared at us, at me and Kaelin, as if we were no longer pack, but two halves of a loaded weapon that had just been placed in their midst. Who was the consumer, and who was the consumed? The prophecy was terrifyingly vague. Was Kaelin, the powerful warrior, meant to absorb my weak essence to become something more? Or was I, the broken Omega, somehow meant to drain him of his strength? "This is madness," Kaelin's voice cut through the stunned silence. It was a raw, serrated sound of pure denial. He took a step away from the heartstone, away from me, as if physical distance could sever the prophetic chain that now bound us. "A dark fable. It means nothing." "Your blood says otherwise," Bourne sneered, his fear now twisting into a new kind of malicious certainty. "Your blood devoured hers on the moon's own tear. The prophecy is clear. The winter wolf will consume the silent shell. He must, to mend what she has broken." He looked at Kaelin, his eyes gleaming. "You must destroy her, Dravos, for the good of the pack." The room erupted. Elders shouted over one another, some agreeing with Bourne's brutal assessment, others recoiling in horror. It was one thing to purge a curse, It was another to command a wolf to ritually destroy another for the sake of a half-remembered prophecy. Through the chaos, my gaze met Kalen's. The look in his eyes was one of such profound torment and revulsion that it stole my breath. He was looking at me not as a woman, or even as an omega, but as a fate he was now shackled to. I was a sentence he had to carry out, and the raw horror on his face told me it was a sentence that disgusted him to his very soul. "Silence!" Alpha Gregor's roar shook the very beams of the chamber. The shouting died instantly, leaving a ringing void. He was breathing heavily, his face a mask of strain. He was the Alpha. This impossible decision rested on his shoulders. He looked at the glowing stone, then at Kalen, and finally at me, huddled with my sleeping son. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at Ren. "A child began this," he said, his voice heavy, "and it is for the sake of the children, the future of this pack, that we must act." He turned to Kalen. "The prophecy says one must be sacrificed for the pack to survive. I will not give the order to kill one of my own based on a forgotten rhyme, but I cannot ignore what the Heartstone has shown us. This connection between you is volatile, a danger. It must be contained or broken." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the council. "Until we can find a clearer path. You are both a threat to the pack's stability. Therefore, you are both exiled from the village." Exiled. The word was a final, brutal blow. To be cast out from the pack, away from the warmth of the community, the safety of its hunters, the wisdom of its healers. It was a death sentence of a different kind. A slow, cold one. "You will take the old trapper's cabin by the Black Creek," Gregor continued, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It is 2 days' walk north, at the very edge of our territory. You will go there, together. You will not leave. Food and supplies will be left for you at the territory line once a week. You will have contact with no one." He was putting us in a cage. A remote, frozen cage, forcing us together to let this prophetic poison play itself out far from the heart of the pack. He was washing his hands of us. "Alpha, you cannot," I cried, my voice cracking. "My son, he needs the warmth of a proper home, the care of the pack." "Your son is the reason we are in this position," Boren spat. "Be grateful the Alpha is not ordering him cleansed as well." "Kalen," Gregor said, his voice softening slightly as he addressed his warrior, "I know this is not a punishment you deserve, but you are bound to this. Your presence here now would only cause fear and division. Go. Live with this connection. Understand it. Tame it or let it run its course. Find out what it truly means. It is the only way." Kalen stared at the Alpha, his face a mask of cold fury. I saw the refusal in the set of his jaw, the rebellion in his storm-gray eyes. He was the pack's guardian. To be exiled was to have his very purpose stripped from him. But then his gaze shifted, moving past the Alpha, past the elders, and landing on me, on Ren, sleeping peacefully against my chest. He saw our helplessness, our terror. He saw that without him, Boren and his faction would tear us apart the moment we were cast out. The prophecy had chained him to me, and the Alpha's decree was now locking that chain. With a barely perceptible nod, he accepted. His shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but with the weary resignation of a man accepting an impossibly heavy burden. He was being banished to protect the very people who were casting him out. "You will leave at once," Gregor commanded. Fendrel, the beta, stepped forward and handed Kalen a leather pack of supplies: dried meat, a flint and steel, a water skin. A meager offering for a long journey. Kalen slung it over his shoulder without a word. The trial was over. We had been judged, and our sentence was exile. The journey from the council chamber back through the village was worse than the walk to it. The news had already spread, a venomous wildfire. We were no longer just the cursed. We were the exiled, the shunned. Doors were barred, shutters were closed. The pack had turned its back on us completely. We were ghosts, walking through a home that was no longer ours. Kalen did not speak. He walked beside me, his silence a heavy, oppressive thing. We stopped only once, at my cottage, where he stood guard at the door while I frantically bundled my few meager possessions: a spare tunic, Ren's extra furs, the small wooden wolf Aaron had carved. As I took one last look at the small, empty room, a wave of grief so profound it almost buckled my knees washed over me. It was the last piece of my old life, of my life with Aaron, and I was being forced to leave it behind. When I stepped out, Kalen's face was grim. He took my bundle from me without a word and added it to his own pack, taking the weight as his own. He led the way out of the village, towards the northern path that wound up into the high, cold forests. I followed, my son a warm weight on my chest, the cold reality of our situation seeping into my bones. We were alone now, utterly alone. Two strangers bound by a terrifying prophecy, banished to the wilderness to let fate decide which of us would devour the other. We walked for hours, the silence between us broken only by the crunch of our boots on the snow and the sigh of the wind through the pines. The sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. The air grew sharp with the promise of a truly bitter night. Wren began to stir, his small whines turning into hungry cries. My milk had been sparse from the stress, and I knew I had to stop, to feed him and find shelter for the night. "We need to stop," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. Kalen halted, turning to look at me. In the fading light, his scar was a pale slash against the harsh plains of his face. He scanned the surrounding forest, his eyes missing nothing. "There is a hunter's lean-to a half-mile ahead. It will offer some protection from the wind." He led on, his pace relentless but not hurried. He moved through the darkening woods with a predator's certainty, as much a part of them as the ancient trees themselves. We reached the lean-to, a crude structure of fallen logs and pine boughs, just as the last of the light bled from the sky. It was small, barely large enough for two, but it was shelter. While I settled myself to feed Wren, Kalen moved with silent efficiency. He gathered dry wood from beneath fallen trees, his movements economical and sure. Within minutes, he had a small crackling fire going, its warmth a desperate comfort against the encroaching cold. I nursed my son, my cloak drawn around us for privacy and warmth. Kalen sat on the other side of the fire, his back to me, sharpening the blade of his knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was a strangely calming sound in the vast, hostile wilderness. He was giving me my space, but his presence was a constant, unnerving weight. Once Wren was fed and settled back into his sling, sleeping soundly, a new and awkward silence fell between us. We were two planets forced into a shared, decaying orbit, circling a fire in the middle of nowhere. "Why?" I finally whispered, at the question torn from the depths of my soul. "Why did you do it? In the chamber? Why offer yourself for the trial? Why accept this exile? You could have let them condemn me." He stopped sharpening his knife. The sudden silence was deafening. He stared into the fire for a long moment, the flames dancing in his storm-gray eyes. "Because whatever that thing is," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp, "whatever this chain is that the boy has forged, it chose me, too." He finally turned his head, and his gaze met mine across the flames. There was no softness in it, no comfort, only a raw, brutal honesty. "This is my fate as much as it is yours," he said, "and I do not run from my fate." He looked down at his own scarred hands, then back at me, his eyes holding a darkness that seemed as vast as the wilderness around us. "And whatever comes for you in this darkness, Ilara Vathrin, it will have to come through me first." His words hung in the space between us, more real than the crackling fire, more solid than the ancient trees that bore witness to them. "Whatever comes for you in this darkness, it will have to come through me first." It was not a promise of affection. It was a warrior's statement of fact, a declaration of the battlefield he now found himself on. I was not his mate to be cherished. I was his territory to be defended. The prophecy had made me his burden, and his honor demanded he bear it. The thought offered no comfort, only a colder, more complicated kind of fear. Sleep was a shallow, restless thing, punctuated by the cry of a night bird, the snap of a twig in the darkness, and the constant, unnerving awareness of the man sleeping a few feet away. He didn't seem to truly sleep. He rested like a predator, a coiled stillness that was ready to spring into violence at a moment's notice. I held Wren close, his soft, steady breathing the only rhythm in the world that made any sense. The scent of him, milky and sweet, was my only anchor to the woman I used to be. The scent of the man across the fire, that wild, clean scent of pine and cold stone, was a constant reminder of the creature I was becoming. We set out again at dawn after a meager meal of dried meat that Kalen insisted I eat the larger share of. The wilderness was beautiful and brutal. Sunlight, thin and white, pierced the canopy in sharp shafts, illuminating swirling motes of frost in the air. The snow was deeper here, untouched by pack life, a pristine blanket that muffled our footsteps. The silence was immense, broken only by the caw of a raven or the distant rush of a frozen creek. Kalen moved through it all with an ease that was both breathtaking and intimidating. He was not a visitor here. He was an intrinsic part of the landscape. He pointed out the tracks of a snow hare, the scrape marks on a tree where a buck had rubbed the velvet from its antlers. He did not speak in long sentences, only in brief, quiet observations. He was reading the forest like a text, and I was an illiterate child trailing in his wake. My own body, softened by 2 years of a quiet widow's life, ached with the strain. The cold bit at my cheeks, and the weight of Wren, a precious burden, seemed to grow with every step. My wolf, however, was more awake than she had been in years. She was alert, every sense straining, drinking in the scents and sounds of the wild. She was aware of Kalen in a way that had nothing to do with my human thoughts. She tracked his position constantly, the powerful, steady beat of his heart, a counterpoint to the wild rhythms of the forest. She recognized his power, his competence, and a part of her, a deep and primal part I had forgotten existed, deferred to it. It was a humiliating and strangely reassuring feeling. By midday, the forest had grown darker, the trees thicker. A sense of unease began to creep over me, a prickling at the back of my neck. The air grew still and heavy. Kalen stopped abruptly, his head cocked, his body utterly motionless. He held up a hand, a silent command for me to halt. I froze, pulling Wren tighter against me. I could hear nothing but the wind, but I could smell it. A new scent on the air carried on the breeze. It was musky, hungry, feral. "What is it?" I whispered. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice a low growl. He shrugged the pack from his shoulders, letting it fall silently into the snow, and drew the long, heavy knife from the sheath at his belt. And then I saw them, shadows detaching themselves from the deeper shadows between the trees. Wolves, but not our kin. These were thinner, their fur mangy and matted. Their eyes held a yellow, feverish light that spoke of starvation and a savage desperation. A wild pack, gaunt from a hard winter, their territory encroached upon. There were 5 of them, fanning out in a semicircle, their movements fluid and coordinated. They were death on 4 paws. My heart hammered against my ribs. My wolf snarled in my head, a sound of pure maternal terror. "Pup, protect the pup." I instinctively backed away, putting Kalen's body squarely between us and the approaching threat. The leader of the pack, a large scarred male with a torn ear, padded forward a few steps, its head low, a deep rumble vibrating in its chest. Its lips peeled back from yellowed teeth, a silent promise of violence. They could smell me, an Omega. They could smell Wren, a helpless pup. We were easy prey, but they could also smell Kalen. He did not move, did not speak. He simply stood there, a mountain of quiet menace, his knife held loosely at his side. He was watching the alpha, his pale gray eyes as cold and flat as river stones. He was waiting. The wild alpha lunged. What happened next was a blur of brutal, lethal grace. Kalen didn't meet the wolf head-on. He pivoted, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. He used the wolf's own momentum against it, his arm catching it across the throat as it flew past. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the alpha fell to the snow, its body twitching once before going still. The other 4 wolves hesitated for a fraction of a second, their attack plan shattered by the instantaneous death of their leader. That fraction was all Kalen needed. He didn't shout, he didn't roar. He let out a sound that was not human. It was a growl that started deep in his chest, a guttural, primal sound of absolute dominance that tore through the quiet forest. It was the sound of an apex predator declaring its territory and its kill. It spoke of blood and bone and a power so ancient it defied words. The sound hit me like a physical blow. It vibrated through the snow, up my legs, and settled deep in my bones. And through the horrifying, invisible chain that bound us, I felt more than just the sound. I felt the intent behind it. I felt the cold, controlled rage, the absolute certainty of his own lethality. My own wolf, instead of cowering in fear, reacted in a way that shocked me to my core. She flattened herself, not in terror, but in acknowledgement. A deep, instinctual submission to a power that was absolute. It was a feeling so primal, so profound, it left me dizzy and breathless. The wild wolves felt it too, their aggression evaporated, replaced by raw, instinctual fear. One whined, its tail tucking between its legs. Another backed away, belly low to the ground. They recognized the true alpha in this clearing, and it was not one of them. With scattered yelps of fear, they broke and fled, melting back into the shadows they had come from, leaving behind only the dead leader and a deafening silence. Kalen stood over the dead wolf for a long moment, his chest rising and falling, the echo of that terrible sound still seeming to hang in the air around him. He finally straightened up, his breathing evening out. He wiped his knife clean on the dead wolf's fur before sheathing it, his movements economical and detached. He turned to face me. His eyes were not the stormy gray I was used to. They were darker, almost black, the pupils blown wide with the fading adrenaline of the fight. He was looking at me, but I felt he was seeing something else. He was seeing the chain, the prophecy, the silent shell that was now his responsibility. "We keep moving," he said, his voice rough, and retrieved his pack from the snow. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. I followed him, my legs trembling, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed, from what I had just felt. He was not just a warrior. He was something more, something older and far more dangerous. The pack had used him as a guard dog, a sentinel on their borders, but I realized now they had no idea what they truly had. They had been keeping a winter storm in a cage, and now they had exiled it, with me. We walked for another hour before he stopped at the crest of a ridge. "There," he said, his voice flat. I looked down into the small, shadowed valley below. A thin ribbon of dark water, the Black Creek, wound through the trees. And there, nestled in a clearing near its bank, was a small, dilapidated cabin. A thread of smoke-gray wood, a sagging roof, a single dark window like a baleful eye. It was utterly isolated, a forgotten place at the edge of the world, our prison, our arena. The final leg of the journey was the hardest. With every step closer, the cabin seemed to grow more oppressive, radiating a sense of profound loneliness and old sorrow. This was where we would live out our sentence. This was where the prophecy would either be fulfilled or broken. Kalen pushed open the heavy, creaking door and stepped inside. I hesitated on the threshold, then forced myself to follow. The interior was one small, dusty room, a rough-hewn table and 2 stools, a stone hearth choked with old ashes, and a crude bed frame in the corner piled with yellowed, musty furs. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the air was stale with the smell of disuse and decay. Kalen dropped the pack onto the table with a heavy thud, the sound echoing in the grim silence. He immediately began to assess the space, his practical warrior's mind taking over. He checked the stability of the roof, the draw of the chimney, the state of the door latch. While he worked, I laid Wren, who had mercifully slept through the wolf attack, onto the cleaner part of the furs. As I stood up, my foot scuffed against something on the dusty floorboards near the hearth. I looked down. There were markings there, lines carved into the wood. My curiosity piqued. I knelt down, using the sleeve of my tunic to wipe away the thick layer of grime. My breath caught in my throat. My blood ran cold. It wasn't random scratches. It was a symbol, an intricate spiraling knot of thorns. And in its center, 2 wolves, one clearly consuming the other. It was the same symbol from the Heartstone. It had been carved into the floor of this cabin, waiting for us. A wave of dizziness and horror washed over me. This was not just a random abandoned cabin. This was not a punishment devised by Alpha Gregor. This was a predetermined place, an altar. The prophecy hadn't just named us. It had prepared a place for its own fulfillment. We hadn't been exiled. We had been delivered. Kalen turned from the window, sensing my distress. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp. I couldn't speak. I could only point with a trembling finger at the floor. He strode over, his gaze following mine. I watched his face as he saw it. The stony mask of control shattered, replaced by a look of raw, dawning horror that mirrored my own. He stared at the carved wolves, at the devouring maw, and I saw the terrible truth land in his eyes. Our cage had been waiting for us all along.